The holiest throne on earth has known thieves, gamblers, murderers, and madmen. The papacy, an office intended for saints, yet sometimes claimed by men whose legacies defy belief. Imagine a pope so consumed by hatred, he dug up his predecessor's corpse and put it on trial. Picture another, a teenager who turned the Vatican into a den of vice. Gambling by day, debauchery by night. Consider a pontiff whose bruised ego silenced one of history's greatest scientific minds, or another who casually sold his divine office like ordinary property. These aren't legends or exaggerations, they are historical truths preserved quietly in chronicles the Church would rather forget. This is the strange side of papal history. 4 popes who ascended the throne of St. Peter, only to descend into scandal, absurdity, and chaos. Their stories begin now. Rome in the late 9th century was a city cloaked in shadow. The once grand empire had fractured, leaving the remnants of its grandeur to slowly decay among winding streets and crumbling marble. The papacy, a seat meant to guide Christendom with divine authority, had become entangled deeply in political intrigue, driven by rival families hungry for power. Stephen VI was born into this uncertain world, a man whose life before ascending to the throne of St. Peter is shrouded in the obscurity common for that chaotic time. What we know paints the image of a cleric ambitious enough to rise through the ranks during a period where survival, let alone advancement, required cunning, connections, and occasionally ruthlessness. When Pope Formosus died in 896, leaving behind a fractured and bitterly divided church, Stephen saw an opportunity. Formosus had been a controversial figure, repeatedly embroiled in disputes and accused of questionable dealings. His reign had split loyalties across Rome and beyond, leaving behind a volatile legacy. As Stephen ascended the papal throne, whispers filled the air, rumors of deep resentment toward Formosus. Perhaps Formosus had wronged him personally, or maybe Stephen was merely a pawn manipulated by influential Roman families who had scores to settle. Whatever the case, Stephen's brief tenure as pope began under clouds of suspicion and resentment. The new pope wasn't driven by visions of spiritual leadership. He seemed obsessed with vengeance. In January of 897, less than a year into his papacy, Stephen VI committed one of the most bizarre and grotesque acts in ecclesiastical history, the Cadaver Synod. Driven by his vendetta against Pope Formosus, Stephen ordered the former pope's corpse to be exhumed from its tomb, dressed in full papal vestments, and placed upon a throne inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran. Picture it clearly, a once powerful pope, now a decaying corpse, draped in fine robes, propped upright, staring vacantly at a gathering of bishops and priests summoned to judge him. Stephen, consumed by anger or perhaps madness, led this macabre spectacle himself. He paced and ranted before the body, shouting accusations of betrayal, perjury, and usurping the papal throne. "Why did you aspire to the papacy unlawfully?" Stephen demanded, his voice echoing within the cold stone chamber, addressing a corpse that offered no response beyond silent decay. The trial was a sham. There was no defense, no witnesses to support Formosus, and certainly no humanity. The corpse was found guilty. Stephen's judgment was swift and ruthless. Formosus was stripped of his papal vestments, the fingers used for blessings were chopped off, and his body was thrown into the Tiber River. Yet Stephen's grotesque spectacle backfired disastrously. Instead of solidifying his power, it repulsed the people of Rome, horrifying even a population accustomed to violence and political turmoil. Rumors began circulating that Formosus' corpse had miraculously washed ashore, demonstrating divine displeasure. Public sentiment rapidly shifted, viewing Stephen not as a righteous leader exacting justice, but as a cruel and possibly insane tyrant. Stephen VI's downfall was swift. The gruesome trial had offended not only the common citizens, but also the powerful noble families and clergy of Rome. Within months, public outrage boiled over into open rebellion. Supporters fled, and Stephen found himself isolated, his once loyal allies turning their backs, seeking to distance themselves from the man now seen as a disgrace to the papacy. In the late summer of 897, barely a few months after the Cadaver Synod, Stephen VI was deposed. Stripped of his titles and imprisoned, the Pope who had so brutally humiliated his predecessor became a prisoner himself, powerless and abandoned. Shortly thereafter, he was strangled to death by unknown assailants, perhaps hired assassins, perhaps betrayed friends. No one intervened, no crowds mourned. Rome moved on quickly, eager to forget the horrific episode. Yet forgetting proved impossible. The Cadaver Synod became a dark legend, forever staining the legacy of the papacy. Stephen's bizarre act haunted the church for centuries, remembered as a powerful cautionary tale of what could happen when vengeance and politics overshadow spiritual authority. In a twist of irony, Pope Formosus, victimized and condemned by Stephen, was eventually rehabilitated. His papacy was officially recognized again by subsequent popes who saw the Cadaver Synod as a horrifying mistake, an embarrassing chapter best relegated to history's shadows. But history rarely forgets its strangest moments. Pope Stephen VI, driven by revenge or madness, forever secured his legacy, not as a saint or reformer, but as the Pope who once dared to put a corpse on trial. Rome in the middle of the 10th century was far from the heart of the once glorious Roman Empire. It had devolved into a lawless city filled with violence, corruption, and powerful aristocratic factions vying for control. Amidst this chaos, in the shadowy halls of power, was born Octavianus, later known as Pope John XII. Octavianus belonged to the powerful family of Count Alberic II of Spoleto, the virtual ruler of Rome. Alberic had managed to consolidate power and wield influence through shrewd politics, making him one of Rome's most formidable figures. Ambitious and ruthless, Alberic envisioned a legacy far greater than his own life. He wished to control the city not just politically, but spiritually. His plan? To place his own bloodline upon the sacred throne of St. Peter. Thus, in December of 955, when the papal seat became vacant, Alberic saw his moment. At merely 18, Octavianus was hastily elected pope, adopting the name John XII. His ascension shocked many. Not only was he exceptionally young, but he was also infamous among Rome's elite as impulsive, headstrong, and reckless. Yet, his lineage and his father's influence silenced objections. Rome's spiritual authority was now placed into the hands of a teenage boy whose character and temperament were largely untested. From the moment of his coronation, John XII seemed less interested in spiritual guidance than in the indulgences of power. His youth, coupled with unchecked authority, quickly unveiled his true nature. He transformed the Vatican into a code playground for his personal desires, filled with extravagant banquets, reckless gambling, and extravagant entertainments. His papal residence echoed with laughter and scandal, hardly resembling the dignified sanctity expected of a pope. As whispers of his debauchery reached beyond Rome, people began to realize the gravity of their young pope's excesses. Yet within Rome itself, a city accustomed to power struggles and decadence, few dared openly challenge him. John XII had risen not through virtue, nor through piety, but through the machinations of powerful men. And now Rome, and indeed Christendom, was paying the price for that calculated gamble. John XII's reign swiftly became a whirlwind of scandal, violence, and chaos. With power unchecked, the young pontiff became infamous not merely for youthful indulgence, but for outright recklessness and immorality unheard of even by Rome's notorious standards. Contemporary chroniclers, shocked by his excesses, painted vivid images of John's Rome. a city where the Vatican had turned into an arena of lustful gatherings, gambling dens, and drunken revelry. Priests whispered rumors of the Pope's numerous illicit affairs, even alleging he invited prostitutes into the Lateran Palace itself. John's blatant disregard for moral and religious decorum deeply scandalized the clergy, who watched in disbelief as their spiritual leader brazenly flouted all ecclesiastical norms. Yet John's sins extended beyond mere immorality. It was said he openly gambled with the wealth of the church, squandering sacred treasures and donations on reckless bets. He was notoriously violent, known for his quick temper and fierce reprisals against those who opposed him. Tales spread that John himself had committed acts of brutality, including severe beatings and possibly murder. Soon, even the secular powers surrounding Rome grew uneasy. The Holy Roman Emperor, Otto I, whose support had been crucial to John's papal legitimacy, began hearing troubling reports about the young pope's disastrous rule. Initially, Otto had hoped John XII could stabilize Rome politically, but now he faced a growing embarrassment. A pope whose behavior brought shame rather than honor to Christendom. The breaking point came when John XII, fearful that Otto would curtail his autonomy, attempted political treachery. He sent emissaries in secret to the emperor's enemies, conspiring openly against the very man who had legitimized his authority. Otto swiftly discovered the betrayal and marched upon Rome, intent on confronting the reckless young pontiff himself. In the autumn of 963, Otto called a council to investigate the Pope's scandals. Bishops and cardinals testified openly, detailing accusations so extreme they shocked even the hardened ears of Rome's nobility. John was publicly accused of simony, murder, sacrilege, and adultery, charges that shook the church to its core. The council swiftly declared John XII deposed, and Otto appointed a new pope, Leo VIII, hoping stability could finally be restored. But John, never one to accept defeat, fled Rome to regroup, vowing to retake his throne. The city held its breath, knowing that the teenage tyrant would not surrender power so easily. John XII's exile was short-lived. Driven by pride and fueled by vengeance, he soon returned with supporters eager to exploit Rome's turmoil for their own advantage. In February 964, rallying Rome's rebellious nobles and angry mobs, John reclaimed the city in a bloody uprising. Pope Leo VIII, Otto's appointed successor, narrowly escaped with his life. Once again in power, John resumed his scandalous lifestyle, seemingly unaffected by his brief humiliation. Yet Rome's patience was thin. Many citizens, clergy, and nobles had finally grown weary of his volatile leadership. Rumors swirled constantly about his immoral activities, each tale seemingly worse than the last. Then, in May of 964, fate intervened. Reports soon spread across Rome that the young pope had been found dead, his lifeless body discovered after an apparent stroke, or, as darker rumors claimed, inflicted by a jealous husband catching him in the act of adultery. Regardless of the truth, Pope John XII died as scandalously as he had lived, leaving behind a papacy forever tainted by his legacy. His death brought relief, but not peace. Rome descended into even more confusion, with rival factions battling violently over his succession. John's tumultuous reign became emblematic of a dark era in papal history, one where morality had collapsed and the sacred throne of St. Peter had been treated as little more than a prize for personal gain. Though later popes sought to erase his memory from church history, John XII's shadow lingered, a stark reminder of the dangers when power falls into irresponsible hands. History has not forgotten this teenage tyrant who became pope not by divine calling, but by ruthless ambition and nepotism. John, the scandalous youth who once ruled the Holy See, remains a potent symbol of papal corruption and excess, a cautionary tale whispered through the centuries, warning that even holiness can be corrupted when humanity's worst instincts take control. In the bustling streets of Renaissance Rome, amid masterpieces, flourishing arts, and the ambitious whispers of cardinals and kings, was born Maffeo Barberini, the man who would one day become Pope Urban VIII. His birth in 1568 into the distinguished but financially modest Barberini family was an introduction to a world where privilege and hardship intermingled, shaping his ambitions and driving him towards a destiny he could scarcely imagine. Young Maffeo displayed extraordinary intelligence and charm early in life, traits that caught the attention of Rome's powerful clerics. His family recognized his potential immediately and invested heavily in his education, sending him to study literature, law, and theology at Rome's prestigious Collegio Romano. There, Maffeo thrived, developing a sophisticated taste for poetry and art and becoming deeply engrossed in intellectual debates. His eloquence and charisma opened doors, soon propelling him upward through the ranks of the church hierarchy. Yet, beneath his charm, lay a profound sense of ambition. Maffeo Barberini was not satisfied with merely serving the church. He envisioned himself leading it. Navigating the treacherous waters of Vatican politics required cunning and carefully cultivated relationships. He skillfully built alliances, cultivating friendships with influential figures such as the Medicis, powerful nobles and cardinals whose support would prove indispensable. Every handshake, every conversation, every whispered confidence brought him one step closer to the pinnacle of power. In 1606, Maffeo's ambitions took a significant leap forward when Pope Paul V appointed him as cardinal. The bright red hat was more than a title. It was a clear signal that Barberini was marked for greater things. From his elevated position, he strengthened his influence in the papal court, nurturing his image as both a cultured intellectual and a shrewd diplomat. His ability to handle sensitive diplomatic missions, negotiating skillfully between Catholic powers, and managing intricate church politics earned him widespread respect among his peers. By 1623, when Pope Gregory XV died unexpectedly, the stage was set perfectly for Barberini's ascent. The papal conclave gathered amid tension and uncertainty, with multiple factions lobbying intensely behind closed doors. Yet, Maffeo Barberini emerged as a unifying candidate, intelligent, cultured, diplomatic, and seemingly neutral. On August 6, 1623, Barberini was elected Pope, taking the name Urban, signifying his desire to oversee a vibrant, flourishing Rome. At first, Pope Urban's election seemed to herald a new age for the Church. Rome buzzed with excitement, hopeful that his enlightened mind and diplomatic prowess would usher in a golden era. Urban himself envisioned a papacy that would make Rome the heart of Christian culture and intellectual achievement. However, with power now firmly in his grasp, Urban soon revealed a different side, a proud, ambitious leader whose desire for greatness sometimes overshadowed prudence. Urban's papacy began with grand visions. He was a man of remarkable intellectual depth and sophistication, eager to turn Rome into the cultural and artistic epicenter of Europe. He sponsored grand building projects, commissioning churches and palaces that still bear his distinctive Barberini crest, adorned with bees symbolizing industriousness and wealth. Yet beneath these glittering projects lay troubling signs of Urban's prideful nature. His family members quickly rose to prominence and power as Urban openly practiced nepotism. He lavishly showered wealth and titles on his nephews, appointing them cardinals and placing them in charge of lucrative church offices. These decisions stirred resentment among other powerful families, igniting simmering tensions across Rome. However, the true test of Urban's character arose in the form of Galileo Galilei, the famed astronomer and physicist. Initially, Urban warmly supported Galileo's intellectual pursuits, fascinated by the revolutionary discoveries and scientific innovations coming out of Galileo's telescope. They exchanged letters, ideas, and praise, seemingly bound by a mutual respect for knowledge and truth. Yet Urban's vanity would soon overshadow reason. Galileo's landmark publication, the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, became the breaking point. While ostensibly neutral, Galileo's book indirectly mocked the Pope, placing his carefully nurtured pride under unbearable pressure. Urban was deeply wounded by what he perceived as a humiliating public slight. He swiftly abandoned intellectual admiration, turning bitterly against the scientist. Fueled by wounded pride and anger, Urban initiated one of history's most infamous trials, branding Galileo a heretic for supporting the Copernican theory that placed the sun at the universe's center, contradicting established church teachings. Urban's earlier support for scientific exploration vanished, replaced by a stubborn insistence on maintaining absolute authority and unquestionable respect. The trial that followed was brutal and uncompromising. Galileo, an elderly man, now broken and frightened, was publicly humiliated, forced under threat of severe punishment to recant his findings, silencing one of history's greatest minds to soothe Urban's injured pride. The trial sent shockwaves across Europe, forever casting Urban as a man who prioritized ego above enlightenment, personal pride above intellectual integrity. Though Urban's reign continued beyond Galileo's trial, his legacy was irrevocably tarnished by the event. The trial marked the decline of his previously celebrated papacy, overshadowing even his grandest accomplishments. Across Europe, intellectuals, artists, and politicians whispered about the Pope who had persecuted one of humanity's greatest scientists out of wounded pride. His lavish expenditures on grand architectural projects and the enrichment of his family left Rome burdened with heavy debts. Taxes soared, resentment spread, and whispers of discontent grew louder. Urban's grand vision of Rome as Europe's cultural capital was crumbling beneath accusations of nepotism, extravagance, and arrogance. In his later years, isolated by scandals and growing distrust, Urban withdrew into bitterness. He saw conspiracies everywhere, suspecting even his closest allies. His once shining reputation dulled, and the Barberini family, which had risen spectacularly with him, began facing hostility and ridicule. When Urban died in 1644, Rome was left divided. His funeral, lavishly orchestrated by his family, seemed more a final display of vanity than an act of mourning. History would not remember him for the artistic commissions or diplomatic successes, but rather for his stubborn pride that led him to silence Galileo. Ironically, Urban's legacy endured precisely because of the Galileo trial. He became emblematic of the tragic conflict between faith and reason, authority and discovery, a cautionary tale of how pride and ego could blind even the brightest intellects. Centuries later, as the Church sought reconciliation with science, Urban's legacy remained a stark reminder of past mistakes. The story of Pope Urban remains not merely a historical footnote, but a powerful lesson on the perils of pride, ego, and the misuse of power. Urban had hoped his reign would represent enlightenment and cultural splendor. Instead, it stands as a lasting symbol of what happens when human flaws are left unchecked, when personal vanity eclipses truth and pride overshadows wisdom. The Rome of the early 11th century was a city adrift in turmoil, a far cry from its imperial grandeur. A battleground for ambitious noble families, Rome had become a city where influence and power could be bought, bartered, and fought for. In this chaotic landscape emerged a figure whose reputation would forever be marked by scandal. Theophylactus of Tusculum, known to history as Pope Benedict IX. Born around 1012 into the powerful Tusculani family, Benedict's life was one of privilege and entitlement from the outset. The Tusculani had dominated Rome's political landscape, with family members repeatedly seizing the papacy to maintain their hold on power. As such, Benedict's path to the papal throne was practically predetermined from birth, not by virtue or devotion, but by lineage and ambition. Barely a teenager, Benedict ascended to the throne of St. Peter in 1032, possibly no older than 20. His election was hardly a spiritual endeavor. Rather, it was a political maneuver engineered by his influential family, intent on consolidating their control. Almost immediately, Benedict's reign exposed his complete disregard for religious decorum, spiritual responsibility, and moral authority. Yet, despite widespread apprehension about his youth, many in Rome initially hoped that Benedict might mature into his role. Unfortunately, their hopes quickly faded. Young and impulsive, Benedict was ill-prepared for the gravity of his office. The immense power vested in him at such a tender age soon revealed his character: indulgent, reckless, and indifferent to the sacred duties entrusted to him. The Vatican and papal residence transformed rapidly from centers of spiritual guidance into hubs of scandal and debauchery. Accounts from chroniclers of the era paint a vivid and disturbing picture. Benedict was widely accused of immorality, licentious behavior, and flagrant disrespect for the sanctity of his position. Despite his youth, he surrounded himself with individuals of questionable character, turning the Vatican into a stage for parties, feasts, and extravagances rarely witnessed within its sacred halls. Yet Benedict was more than merely indulgent. He was politically ruthless, too. He leveraged the power of the papacy to strengthen his family's grip on Rome, often engaging in vicious feuds with rival factions. The young pope swiftly earned powerful enemies, whose opposition was tempered only by fear of the Tusculani family's violent retribution. Nevertheless, Benedict's reputation spread far beyond Rome's walls, reaching the courts of European monarchs and the ears of pious churchmen who watched in horror as the Holy See descended into infamy. Despite growing outrage, no immediate force seemed capable of dislodging Benedict. His family's power was too entrenched, their influence too widespread. Rome once again found itself under the control of a pope whose sole qualification was his bloodline and whose principal interest appeared to be pleasure and power rather than piety. Benedict IX's scandalous reign was just beginning, and Rome's darkest chapter was about to unfold. The extent of Benedict IX's misrule gradually transformed scandal into outright chaos. If his youth and initial indulgences had seemed merely disgraceful, the subsequent years revealed a depth of corruption and depravity previously unseen within the papacy. Benedict's behavior deteriorated rapidly, becoming increasingly erratic, unpredictable, and violently oppressive. Chroniclers describe a Vatican where morality had utterly collapsed. Benedict was alleged to have participated in theft, extortion, and open violence against perceived enemies and rival factions. His palace was said to be a scene of unending revelry, where alcohol flowed freely and licentiousness knew no bounds. The Pope himself was accused of crimes so severe that even the tolerant and morally flexible Roman aristocracy was scandalized. As Benedict's rule descended into chaos, opposition intensified. Rival noble families, angered by his open disregard for decorum and his ruthless political maneuvers, mobilized their supporters. Rome fractured into factions, openly warring for control, turning the city into a powder keg ready to explode. In 1044, widespread dissatisfaction erupted violently. The Crescenzi family, longtime rivals of the Tusculani, seized their opportunity. They forced Benedict IX from Rome, installing an antipope, Sylvester III, in his place. Yet Benedict, unwilling to relinquish power so easily, quickly regrouped. Supported by loyalists and family allies, he returned to Rome in a wave of bloodshed, reclaiming the papacy after fierce and violent clashes that left the city battered and deeply scarred. However, Benedict's victory was hollow, as his return only intensified Rome's instability. Realizing his position was increasingly untenable, Benedict did the unthinkable. He decided to sell the papacy itself. Negotiating with his godfather, Giovanni Graziano, a wealthy and influential Roman priest, Benedict exchanged the holiest office in Christendom for a substantial sum of gold, willingly resigning the papal throne. This unprecedented transaction shocked even a Rome accustomed to scandal. The spiritual leader of millions had openly commodified his sacred duty, treating it like any other asset to be bartered away for personal gain. Rome reeled from the indignity, and Europe watched in disbelief as news spread of Benedict IX's extraordinary and disgraceful decision. Yet even after his sale of the papacy, Benedict IX's turbulent tale was not yet complete. Shortly after Giovanni Graziano became Pope Gregory VI, Benedict experienced regret, or possibly greed. Dissatisfied with his choice, he once again attempted to reclaim his lost throne, plunging Rome into further turmoil. By 1046, Rome faced an unprecedented crisis. Three claimants simultaneously declared themselves Pope: Benedict IX, Gregory VI, and Sylvester III. This untenable situation demanded external intervention. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, determined to end the chaos, marched to Rome to resolve the crisis. In December 1046, Henry called the Council of Sutri, summoning all three popes to answer charges. Benedict IX, wisely sensing defeat, refused to appear, fleeing Rome into obscurity. The council deposed all three, appointing Clement II, bringing temporary peace to Rome. Benedict IX, the disgraced former pope, spent the remainder of his life in relative anonymity, fading from historical records. His death around 1056 went largely unnoticed and unrecorded, a quiet end to one of the most tumultuous and scandal-ridden papacies in history. Yet Benedict IX's legacy endured in infamy. For centuries, historians and theologians pointed to his reign as a powerful example of moral corruption within the Church, a stark reminder of how easily sacred authority could be corrupted by ambition, greed, and recklessness. The sale of the papacy by Benedict remains a uniquely shocking moment in Church history, illustrating the profound dangers when religious offices are seen as commodities rather than sacred responsibilities. His reign is a cautionary tale of youthful irresponsibility meeting unchecked power, a warning echoed through the centuries. To this day, Pope Benedict IX remains synonymous with scandal, a pope remembered not for holiness nor even human virtue, but for embodying the most extreme corruption possible within a position designed to inspire moral leadership. His story is an enduring testament to how ambition, greed, and power, when left unchecked, can lead to madness, disgrace, and ultimately ruin. The stories we've journeyed through, each marked by scandal, madness, and disgrace, serve as vivid reminders that even the holiest of offices can fall prey to human frailty. Pope Stephen's grotesque cadaver synod, Pope John XII's youthful tyranny, Pope Urban's wounded pride silencing the voice of science, and Pope Benedict IX's unprecedented sale of the papacy. These moments define not just the individuals involved, but the very institution they led. Yet these four popes are far from the only occupants of St. Peter's throne who succumbed to scandal. History's corridors echo with the whispers of countless other pontiffs who, for reasons of vanity, ambition, or sheer incompetence, found themselves on the darker side of history. Their stories, although less infamous, deserve at least brief acknowledgement, illustrating the timeless lesson that spiritual authority is no shield against moral failure. Take Pope Alexander VI, the notorious Rodrigo Borgia, whose papacy from 1492 to 1503 was marked by nepotism, political manipulation, and moral scandal. Alexander elevated family members to positions of power, using the papacy not as a sacred trust, but as a personal fiefdom to expand the infamous Borgia influence. His court became a byword for corruption and immorality, yet his complex, charismatic persona continues to captivate historians centuries later. Then there was Pope Sergius III, whose papacy from 904 to 911 marked the beginning of the infamous Saeculum Obscurum, or Dark Age of the papacy. Sergius ascended the throne through murder and manipulation, embroiling the Vatican in violence and intrigue. His reign was shadowed by scandal, and he is often remembered as the first pope of an era when powerful Roman families controlled the church as though it were their private property. Consider also Pope Innocent VIII, who ruled from 1484 to 1492. Despite his chosen name, Innocent's reign was anything but innocent. He openly acknowledged numerous illegitimate children, using his papal office to secure advantageous marriages and positions for them. His lavish spending, funded by questionable practices such as simony, the selling of church offices, contributed significantly to the widespread perception of corruption within the church, helping to set the stage for the upheaval of the Reformation decades later. And we must not overlook Pope Leo V, who served from 1513 to 1521. Born Giovanni de' Medici, Leo's extravagant tastes and obsession with artistic grandeur drained the church's coffers and precipitated the sale of indulgences, a practice directly contributing to Martin Luther's explosive protest and the Protestant Reformation. Leo famously remarked, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," a reflection of the lavish indulgence that ultimately fractured the unity of the Western Church. Each of these popes, while perhaps less sensationally notorious than our main subjects, highlights the persistent vulnerability of the papacy to the flaws and failings of humanity. Their collective tales reveal a common thread: the intersection of immense spiritual responsibility with personal ambition, greed, and human weakness. This combination, when left unchecked, consistently led to tragedy, corruption, and scandal. Yet amidst these tales of moral collapse, history also provides a hopeful counterpoint. Popes who rose to the occasion, reforming the church and redeeming the very office tarnished by their predecessors. Popes like Gregory the Great, whose compassion and humility brought moral restoration. Leo XIII, whose wisdom guided the church into the modern age. Or John Paul II, whose powerful witness and global leadership reaffirmed the papacy's spiritual significance. Indeed, the story of the papacy is complex, a reflection of humanity itself, containing within it the capacity for both remarkable holiness and profound corruption. These troubled pontificates remind us that no institution, no matter how sacred, is immune from human failing. They challenge us to recognize the delicate balance required of leaders entrusted with immense power, spiritual or otherwise, and the ease with which that power can corrupt, if not governed by virtue. Throughout history, the actions of scandalous popes have often overshadowed the broader spiritual mission of the Church, casting long, sometimes irreparable shadows on its reputation. Yet these dark moments also sparked critical reforms and renewal, as individuals within and outside the Church demanded accountability and change. In a sense, these infamous figures inadvertently became catalysts for positive transformation, prompting introspection and institutional correction. In reviewing these infamous chapters, it becomes clear that history does not merely judge the moral failures of these individuals, but evaluates the very structures of power and influence within which they operated. The papacy, like any institution, reflects the ambitions, strengths, weaknesses, virtues, and vices of the humans who occupy it. Recognizing this complexity helps us better understand the historical context in which these scandals unfolded, highlighting the continual need for transparency, humility, and accountability in positions of authority. Reflecting on these turbulent pontificates provides valuable lessons even today. They caution us against unchecked power, warn us about the seductive lure of ambition, and remind us that leadership without moral compass inevitably leads to ruin. Yet they also teach resilience, demonstrating how even the gravest scandals can ultimately inspire renewal and reformation. Perhaps this is the most enduring legacy of these infamous popes. Their stories remain compelling not just as cautionary tales, but as profound reflections on human nature itself. They provoke us to question the true nature of power, authority, and spiritual leadership. They invite contemplation on the fragile interplay between virtue and vice, reminding us that greatness and infamy often coexist in close proximity. As we conclude this exploration into some of history's most scandalous papacies, we are left with an understanding richer for having acknowledged the flaws alongside the virtues. These popes' legacies persist not only in the annals of history, but also in ongoing dialogues about leadership, morality, and the nature of power. Their scandals echo through time, instructing future generations and guiding those who hold authority to act with greater humility, caution, and accountability. Ultimately, these papacies remind us of a timeless truth, that even in the holiest of roles, humanity remains profoundly human, vulnerable to temptation and corruption, but also capable of renewal and redemption. This enduring paradox continues to define not only the papacy, but every institution of power, inviting constant vigilance, reflection, and wisdom from leaders and followers alike. And perhaps, above all, these stories remind us that history, in its complexity, neither condemns nor absolves entirely. It simply tells the story, allowing us to reflect, to learn, and hopefully to grow wiser in our understanding of power, virtue, and the ever-present potential for human fallibility.